So our next unit is going to be on ecosystems. So a lot of stuff on here is going to be review from biology when we learned about food webs and all of that stuff. But some of it will be new. So we'll be going over what will be new as well as covering what is from the old stuff. All right, so the first thing we need to know the definition of an ecosystem. It is a particular location on Earth distinguished by biotic and abiotic components. Okay, this definition's a little more wordy than the one that you learned, right? The one you learned was just like all of the living and non-living things, biotic and abiotic in an area. That's fine. You can write that, okay? So biotic means living. So when we talk about living things, we're talking plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and then abiotic. So in terms of sand and soil and rocks and air and water and all of those things. We can say a wetland ecosystem is different from a forest ecosystem because of the different types of biotic things, right? A forest would have lots of tall trees. A wetland would have lots of aquatic plants. And then abiotic, a wetland's going to have a lot more water than a forest, okay? So the key points here, when we're talking about ecosystems, one thing the book likes to talk about is how do we determine where a forest ends and where the prairie begins? Like, does it end here? What about here? What about here? It's really hard to figure out where ecosystems begin and end as they kind of bleed into each other. So it's really, when we're talking about ecosystems, we can try to make it really simple and be like, oh, this area is a wetland. Okay, but where do we determine where that begins and ends? It gets a little fuzzy, okay? So yes, we can talk about a wetland ecosystem or a forest ecosystem, but know that things in the real world aren't super cut and dry. It's not just like, oh, this little rectangle patch is a wetland, okay? So they'll talk about boundaries, okay? Some ecosystems, don't write this down. Some ecosystems are really big, some are really small, some have really distinct boundaries, some of them bleed into others. There's just a lot of variation. Don't worry too much about that, okay? Now, recap. The first thing on that blank, all of the energy that powers ecosystems comes from the sun. This is the first thing you're writing down. So all energy that powers ecosystems comes from the sun. You guys know that from bio. A producer or autotroph is an organism that produces its own energy, usually from the sun. Two examples you might want to write down: phytoplankton, okay, and plants. Those are really common ones. So phytoplankton and plants. Phytoplankton are little green plankton like SpongeBob and in SpongeBob. And these little phytoplankton, they do photosynthesis. And there are lots of organisms in the ocean that then eat them, but they're little tiny things. You need to use a microscope to see them, basically. Think of little tiny seaweeds floating around. We also have chemoautotrophs. Chemoautotrophs are organisms that live in really extreme places typically. They can actually use chemicals like sulfur in order to produce their own energy. So they can take chemicals, absorb those chemicals, and then use them to make energy instead of using sunlight. Now, we are not chemoautotrophs. We cannot make our own energy simply by taking chemicals in our environment, but we can take in foods. There's a little bit of a difference there. Where do we find chemoautotrophs? Deep down in the ocean, hydrothermal vents, okay? Places where there isn't access to sunlight. Consumers or heterotroph are organisms that obtain energy by consuming other organisms. So animals, humans, okay, some fungi, we'll talk about those. So to recap then, photosynthesis, sunlight, using sunlight to produce sugar. Now if you remember, what is the equation for photosynthesis? Well, what does a plant need? A plant needs water. I'm actually going to type this. So plant needs water. What else does a plant need? Sunlight. And what do plants take in? This is super important. You need to know this. They take in CO2. So water, sunlight, CO2, and they use it to then produce oxygen and glucose or sugar. All right. So this is really important because we're going to be talking about plants and how they impact the carbon cycle. They take in carbon. That's why the more trees that we cut down, the more carbon they're releasing into the air and the more carbon that we're getting, which is leading to climate change. Okay. Water and sunlight and CO2 makes oxygen and glucose. Another part of the carbon cycle we're going to talk about is cellular respiration. Okay. Which uses oxygen to break down sugar and create energy. If you remember from bio, it's the opposite equation. We take glucose and oxygen, and we make ATP and water and CO2. Again, why is that important? Well, again, we've got carbon here, okay? So we're going to be talking about the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and cellular respiration and photosynthesis impact these cycles. They impact how these molecules cycle through our atmosphere. The one thing I need you to know for cellular respiration, so photosynthesis makes sugar, cellular respiration makes energy. The one thing I need you to know is it's used by every single organism, all organisms, okay? All organisms need energy. So all of them take sugar and break it down. The only difference is that some of them have to eat sugar, like us, and some of them can make sugar through photosynthesis, okay? So all organisms do cellular respiration. So when we talk about carbon then, photosynthesis removes carbon from the atmosphere and cellular respiration adds carbon to the atmosphere. So for example, a tree. A tree takes carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, right? It also releases some into the atmosphere, but the amount that it releases is a lot smaller, okay? Remember, all organisms do cellular respiration. Now, when the cow eats the plant, right, the carbon goes into the cow. When the human eats the cow, carbon goes into the human. Okay, again, all organisms do cellular respiration. So these guys are emitting carbon dioxide as well, okay, because every time you guys breathe out or every time a plant does cellular respiration, it's emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, I will tell you that the amount of carbon dioxide that we breathe out and that organisms breathe out, that's not really playing a huge role in climate change. It's the burning of fossil fuels and cutting down of trees. So the next part here is going to be a little bit of review, right? Herbivores eat what? They eat plants. Carnivores eat what? They eat organisms, other animals, or meat. And what do omnivores eat? They eat both. Don't forget, other animals can include insects. So if there's something eating insects, it's a carnivore because that's another animal, okay? So that should be review. Another word that you may or may not have heard of, detritivore or decomposer. We're going to use them synonymously, meaning I'm going to interchange those two words, but they break down dead tissues and waste into smaller particles. So dung beetles, termites, ants, earthworms, bacteria, some fungi. They basically break down stuff into smaller particles and return it to the soil. And this is why it's so important because they can help when, say for example, we have a dead log, a dead tree, something like that. Well, all that carbon's left in that tree and we can't have any other organisms use it. What they do is they break it down, return it to the soil. So now that soil's got the carbon, the nitrogen, the other nutrients it has, and other organisms can use it as well. You'll see that this picture breaks it down into two separate ones. So like decomposers, they have as different than detritus feeders. So detritivores means they actually feed on dead and decaying stuff. Decomposers means they break down stuff. We're not going to worry about the difference between the two because I've never actually seen a question that asks about the difference. Just know they both break down stuff. You need to know examples of them. Okay. Termites eat wood. They break down wood. Carpenter ants, same thing. Okay. Fungus and bacteria and mushrooms break down stuff as well. Earthworms. All right, as a review, okay, remember producers go at the bottom of the food chain. My arrows always point towards the organisms that are getting the energy. So notice when we have these food webs or food chains, the arrows are pointing to the organism that gets the energy. I don't care if you draw your food web up and down. I don't care if you draw them side to side. I don't care if you draw them, going down this way, but they have to be pointing to the organism that gets the energy. Okay, so that's super important. I know I made a big deal about it in biology as well. After producers, we get whatever eats the producers. Those are primary consumers. So for example, here we've got algae. There's another type of plankton called zooplankton. That's these little microscopic guys, and they eat plants. Okay, they're not phytoplankton. They can't do photosynthesis themselves, but they eat plants. So primary consumers, stuff that eats plants. Secondary consumers, whatever eats the primary consumer, tertiary consumer, and so on. So review, primary consumers eat producers, okay, secondary eat primary, tertiary eat secondary, okay, they don't typically have any natural, a lot of natural predators, and they typically have really small populations. You have this written down already. And then an apex predator, the apex is the peak of a mountain, okay, or the top, right? So the apex is at the top of the food chain and has few natural predators. So think of a shark, okay? Think of a lion, something at the top that has not very many natural predators. All right, a trophic level, okay? Distinct level of feeding within an ecosystem. So when we talk about the first trophic level, right, we number them going up. The first one is plants. Second one is primary consumers. Second one, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, okay? So in that little triangle, don't worry about writing this because you already have that in there. Just write a distinct level of feeding. So in that triangle that you have, what I would like you to do is fill in the fact that producers are on the bottom. So write producers in here. And then we get primary consumers. And then we get secondary consumers. And then we get tertiary consumers. If you want, you can label the trophic levels, like 1, 2, 3, 4. The first one's always going to be producers. So the common trophic levels, again, are going to be, we might call them the first or second trophic level, but we also call them producers, primary, secondary, tertiary. Again, notice we've got heat leaving because heat leaves, right? When we transfer energy, not all of the energy can be transferred from one to the next completely. Which law is that? Second law of thermodynamics. When we transfer energy, the amount of work it's able to do decreases. All right, wonder where I put this. Okay, well, apparently that got deleted. Okay, so what I want you to do, I just want you to write here 10% of the energy can be converted. I'll write it down. 10% of the energy at one trophic level can be passed to the next. So what happens to the other percentage? I just want you to write this down. You can write it in that blank space that you have under how many trophic levels, because that was supposed to be deleted. So where it says how many trophic levels, just write down 10% of the energy at one trophic level can be passed to the next, okay? Easy way to do 10%, you just move the decimal over 1. Okay? The reason we call this ecological efficiency, which don't worry too much about this term because you don't actually really need to know that specific term. You just need to know that 10% goes from one level to the next. Easiest way is to just take off or move the decimal point over. So if I'm converting 1500 to the next level, I just move the decimal over 1. Okay, so it's 150 at the next level. So 10% can be passed to the next trophic level. The rest gets lost as heat or weight or waste, or it's used by the organism, something along those lines. Okay. All right, last but not least, you guys know these two. Food chain, just a straight chain. Okay, food web, more realistic. It's not just a line, right? So today you guys are going to be doing a food web worksheet. So you're going to be like making food webs for me. They're pretty simple, but remember, your arrows are always pointing to the organism that gets the energy, okay? So if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I will have my computer all day and we'll be checking it. Otherwise, the worksheet that you guys are getting, the food web worksheet, will be due tomorrow. So go ahead and get working on that, and I will see you all tomorrow.